It's time for another Woodsmith project build. Now this particular project that we're going to be working on is a reader favorite and a visitor favorite for anybody who stops by our shop here in Des Moines, Iowa. Now it's an angle grinder station, and a lot of folk who see it in person think that it's a commercial tool, that you can go out and buy it. And we've shown it on the TV show, and it's been in a few other videos on our YouTube channel, and you can check those out. But what's really cool about it is it takes a regular angle grinder and attaches it to this tool that essentially turns it into a portable, accurate cutting machine. There's a sliding carriage that allows you to bring the angle grinder forward and then back through a cut to be able to make smooth, accurate cuts in all kinds of metal pieces. And in spite of its looks, it's actually pretty easy to make. It's mostly plywood with a couple of smatterings of hardwood throughout. So I want to break up this project build into 3 different sections. We'll focus on the base and this arm piece. In the second section, we'll take care of the sliding carriage with the handle that pivots and moves along the arm. For the final section, we're going to tackle the metalworking, where we'll add these metal inserts to the table along with a metal U-channel to help corral the sparks and avoid any issues with heat and fire. The last thing is the adjustable fences. They can be placed in one of 2 positions, this forward position here or back here if you're working with wider pieces. It's a fun project to make, and even as a woodworker, there's a lot of times where you're going to be modifying hardware or maybe even making some custom pieces to add an extra bit of flair to your projects. So join me as we tackle this cutoff grinder station and put it to use in your shop. We're working from the ground up on making our grinder cutoff station, and that begins with a solid base. Now, this part is one of the easiest parts of the entire project. It's just 3 layers of plywood that are glued together. Now, while a lot of the other pieces, especially the moving parts, we're going to use Baltic birch plywood. For the base here, you don't really need to go with the Baltic birch. You just need something relatively smooth and flat. So I have some standard birch plywood that I'm going to use. I've cut the pieces to their final size, and I'm just going to glue them on 1 layer at a time. Now what you could do is start with pieces that are slightly oversized, glue them up, and then cut them to size, but I find that this way works just as well. So we'll peel off the top 2 layers here, and I want to put a generous amount of glue around the outside, and then your standard glue squiggles across the middle. You can add glue if you need to, just to get a good even coverage across the entire panel. Now for a spreader, I'm just using an old gift card or affinity card, heck, your even old Blockbuster membership card, and just kind of notch the ends with pinking shears to allow it to spread glue evenly across the surface. All right, then we can add our next layer here. Just want to get it tacked into place here or set up, and then I can apply glue to for the top layer. All right, once you have an even layer, you can apply the top layer. You don't need to add any more glue because you're done at this point. Now it's just a matter of clamping things up. The issue here, though, is that these parts with the glue on there, the glue kind of acts as a little bit of a lubricant, and things start sliding around. So I'll take a few small clamps and just start squeezing things together here, just checking with my fingertips on how everything's lining up. As you start applying more clamps, you might feel some of these layers moving around. If that happens, you can just grab a longer bar clamp and clamp it right across one of the joint lines there, and you could start to pull those back into alignment. I like to have 2 of them around. That way I can kind of move things and shift pieces around as I need to. Just to keep things in place. Now it's kind of all hands on deck for all your little clamps. to get a solid amount of clamping pressure all the way around. How many clamps do you need? Well, I'm going to leave that up to you and the number of clamps that you have to begin with, and that little voice in your head that tells you when you need to add a few more. Once the glue is dry and the clamps come off of the base, we can clean up the edges by removing any glue squeeze out. I headed over to the edge sander and sanded those edges smooth. Then we'll take care of a little bit of layout. The first thing is to lay out the shape for a tab that's formed on the back edge. That's where that main support arm is going to go. Now, removing this material helps save a little bit of weight on here. You'll also lay out a radius on all of the outside corners of the base. And then while I had a nice square blank, I laid out the locations of some holes that we'll drill to install the fence later on. Now, one way to help make your grinder station look more like a commercial tool is to have those radiuses on here, especially where this tab is formed. Now, to get a nice even radius, rather than try and cut it at the bandsaw, I headed over to the drill press and used a big Forstner bit. You could also use a hole saw and drill out that radius. You can use the edges of that hole now to go back over to the bandsaw. And here you'll make two cuts using a rip fence as a guide to make a straight cut along the back, and then for the second cut make a much shorter one, but you still want to maintain a nice square edge. Now, while I was at the bandsaw, I took the opportunity to kind of lop off the waste on the radiuses for each of the corners. Then it was over to the edge sander where I could smooth those edges. But if you don't have an edge sander, you can still smooth out those curves. And I'm going to install this in the vise here. Since we cut off most of the waste at the bandsaw, I can now use a coarse file and start creating more facets that get us closer to a curved edge. Now, I want to avoid chip out here, so I'll put a light chamfer there. Now you can see with the rasp, you can get pretty quickly, you can start to shape that smooth curve. It looks a little raggedy on the edges, but that's where you'll grab a file now. You can just hear the difference. Once you have a curve that feels right, I'll finish it off with just a sanding block and some coarse sandpaper, like 100 or 120 grit. This is going to get painted after all, so we don't need to be too fussy here. In a similar vein, this long cut that I did with the bandsaw can sometimes leave some blade marks and a little raggedy edge. So I have been known to grab a block plane and plane the edge of the plywood. Yep, you can do it. It does dull the plane a little bit, but as a woodworker, it doesn't take much to be able to sharpen the blade back up and get it back into shape. The next part of the grinder station to make is an arm assembly that gets attached to the back edge of the base. It's made up of 5 layers. What we have is a 2-layer section that forms the main support arm. On one side of that is a slightly smaller version of it, gets glued in place. And then to complete it are these 2 smaller blocks that get glued in place. The idea here is that we want a large surface area at the bottom to create a rigid attachment point, because this is where the sliding carriage is going to end up being attached to. We don't want it wiggling around. Now, since we're at this point, I'm moving to creating all these pieces with Baltic birch plywood because I want that strength and rigidity here. To make them, I started by gluing up a blank for the main support arm. Then, just like I did on the base to create the shape, I laid it out and then went over to the drill press where I drilled out the inside radius. I did the same thing on this smaller support block too. It's got a slightly larger radius, so I did that with a hole saw. And over at the bandsaw, I can set up a rip fence to make this short cut so that it's nice and smooth and parallel to the back edge. From there, we're going to move the rip fence out of the way and connect the dots from the end of the support arm into where that radius is. Wrapping things up, we'll head over to the router table where you want to round over all the outside edges. Now keep in mind here that this smaller support arm gets glued in place. So you want to pay attention to where you are going to be rounding over those pieces and where you don't want to avoid creating a gap. Now these little guys here are relatively small. So what I did is I made an extra long blank, headed over to the table saw, and then used a stop block attached to my rip fence. That way, as I cut the piece free, it's not going to get pinched between the blade and the rip fence. Again, that gets rounded over. Now, I don't want to glue these on just yet, but you can see how they're shaped in a much similar format. What I want to do is get this smaller support arm attached to the main support arm. Just spread some glue, and since it's relatively small, I can just rub it around here to spread it around. We'll let the glue set up a little bit, and then it's time to go over to the drill press, take care of drilling some holes. To connect the arm to the base, we want to use 2 thick carriage bolts. And I want to recess the nuts and washers on the bottom face. So to start off, I laid out the position of those 2 holes, and I'm using a Forstner bit to create that counterbore. I'm going to switch out to a 1/2-inch brad point bit and drill the through holes. Now the next step is to transfer the hole locations from the base to the arm assembly that we just got done gluing up. Then you want to use the dimples left by marking those holes and set up your drill press and fence to be able to drill all the way through. Now, you might need to get a longer bit to be able to get through the full 6 inches, or you can drill most of the way through and finish it up with a spade bit if you need to. It's time to take care of a little assembly now. With the holes in our support arm, we can attach it to the base in order to accomplish a few other steps here. So what I'm going to do is attach it with a couple of really long carriage bolts. Slip those in through the holes in the arm. Then just set them with a mallet here real quick. And I can fit that into the base. Then on the bottom side, I want to put a washer in each one of those holes and a lock nut. Then I'll tighten everything down with a socket here. The next step is to glue on the side support pieces. Like we talked about earlier, these just add a little bit more surface area along the bottom edge to help keep this whole arm rigid. Now the key thing here though when we're attaching the side blocks is to glue them just to the arm. We need to take this arm off for a couple of other steps down the road, so you don't want it permanently in place. So just add a little glue, and then I just center them on the support arm here. You can measure it if you really need to be that particular about it. Keep them flush with the bottom edge and then just clamp it in place. One final component we need to make to our base assembly is this long rail. It gets screwed to the support arm that we just added to the base. Now on the upper and lower edge of this rail, we'll install a pair of plastic runners. And those runners will allow the sliding carriage assembly that holds the angle grinder to move smoothly back and forth. To cut the grooves for the runners, I've installed a dado blade here in the table saw and set it up to be centered on this blank. Now the rail I've made from 2 layers of 1/2 inch plywood, so it's 1 inch thick. And while I'm at it, I also have another blank that's going to be cut apart later to go on the carriage. And it needs to house those runners as well. So while I have everything set up, I'll just make those cuts. All right, now this rail with the plastic glides is installed just with screws onto the support arm, just in case you need to remove it while we work on the next bits. And this wraps up the first section of our grinder cutoff station. We made a thick plywood base, a support arm, and this rail. In the next video, we're going to add the sliding carriage that moves back and forth on the rail and houses the angle grinder. We'll wrap things up in the third video with the metal inserts on the table and the fences. And at that point, you're ready to put it together. So I hope you stick around. In this section, we're going to build a carriage that will slide along here and also hold on to the grinder. Now, one of the first things that we want to do is actually a piece that we made back in section 1. When we cut the grooves for this plastic runners on the top and bottom of this rail, I cut another blank here, but this time instead of a snug fit, I wanted a smooth sliding fit. We're going to cut this down into 2 pieces that are going to wrap both the top and bottom of this runner, and then attached to that we're going to make a carriage plate that's going to allow us to build out from here to attach other pieces onto it, including that grinder. So what I want to do now, after I cut these to length, is we're going to go over to the drill press and the router table and cut out this carriage plate and add a few details to it. There are a few details to take care of on the carriage plate. The first is to drill a mounting hole in the center of your plate blank here. And then we'll also need to form a short slot and then a longer slot on the opposite ends. Now you'll notice I have a longer blank here. I'm actually making 2 of these grinder stations. So I have the 2 carriage plates laid out here on a single blank. Another thing you'll notice is that in addition to drilling out the mounting holes, I drilled a hole to represent the end points of all of those slots. And the reason I do that is because it's an easy way to get a router table set up to create really smooth slots. So what I can do is take one of these end holes and using a 1/2 inch diameter straight bit in the router table, position the blank right over the bit, and then I can bring the router table fence up to the edge. For the end slots, route until the bit reaches that hole. On the opposite end, I'll just drop the bit over the hole and then continue out the back of the piece. Now I know exactly where I need to route because it's just a matter of connecting the dots on the 2 holes here for this slot. Before making any other changes, I'm going to make a second pass, but this time just flipping the piece over, repeating the same process. Now I've removed material from both the top and the bottom faces. Leaves me with just a thin web in the middle. I can just raise the bit, make another set of cuts, and I'm all done here. Once the slots were formed, I took the blank over to the table saw, set the miter gauge to 45 degrees, and cut the carriage plate to its final length with that angled cut there. I also took the time to knock off the corners on the carriage plate. Just makes it a little bit more friendly so there aren't any sharp corners to catch on you. I also made a pair, cut the stop or the guides to length. Those also have the corners taken off just for ease and comfort as well. So we're ready to take care of a little assembly here. And that starts by gluing the carriage plate to those guides. And I'm going to do that by just putting a little bit of glue on one of the guides, setting it in place on those runners on the arm, and then I can attach this so that it's flush at the top edge and at the front. I'll just set that in place here and clamp it up. Then I'll apply glue to the lower guide. And again, I just want it flush at the front and should be flush at the bottom, but if it isn't, it's not a real big deal. The real reason that I'm gluing this up around the arm here is I want to make sure that this whole assembly can slide fairly easily back and forth on the arm. Once that's taken care of and the glue's dry, remember I'm making a second one, so I have that one over here. We need to add a couple of more pieces. The first is a hardboard disc that the handle assembly is going to pivot around. So I'm just going to squirt a little bit of glue here on this one. That fits over a carriage bolt that's mounted and installed on the back side of our carriage plate. So that's really simple to install. And then there are these plywood stops that you'll need to make. There's a relieved corner at the front and a long one at the back. And the stop is going to be used to hold the angle grinder in its upright position. So once it comes up, this will be the resting point for that. Again, there's nothing super complex here. Just gets glued in place, and then it's flush with the edge of the slot here, and then back 1/4 inch. And I marked a line on the piece, and we'll just set that in place. I'm using a fast setting glue here so that it doesn't take long. Grab a clamp. Once the glue's dry on that, we can get started on the other half of this carriage assembly, and that's the handle assembly. I said that our sliding assembly on the arm consists of two parts. There's this part that basically just does what I said, that slides back and forth on the arm. The second part is what holds the angle grinder and then pivots it into the workpiece to be able to make your cuts. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to now. It starts with a larger plate here that's going to get attached to the sliding assembly. And then we're also going to be making the handle that allows you to control the angle grinder, but then also keeps your hand up out of the way of the action for safety. So what I've done is I printed out one of the patterns online from the plans that has the handle pattern on here. So you can see there's the handhold and a couple of holes and some notches on there. I had some scrap plywood from other parts of the project that I'm going to be using here. It's attached with double-sided tape. We'll take care of some steps on both of these pieces over at the drill press, and then we'll come back here and put everything together. The handle assembly that we're making now has to pivot smoothly on the sliding assembly we just made. Now you remember that there's a hardboard disc that I cut out and glued to that sliding assembly. Now the whole thing is going to pivot around a bolt, but in order for it to do that without a lot of slop, we're going to make a matching hardboard donut, for lack of a better word, that's going to go over the top of that and help that whole assembly slide and pivot smoother. I'm going to do that here at the drill press using a couple of circle cutters. Now I have 2 of them so that I could dial in the fit for both of them just to speed things along for on camera. The first thing that I want to do is take my donut blank and I'm going to attach it to a plywood backer for these 2 steps here. So that's going to hold it in place while we take care of them. Later on I'll go back and clean up all my shop litter. Now the first step that I'm going to show is to cut this outer diameter for it. So I have the circle cutter set up here so that it creates the wide radius that I'm going to need. So you can see that with the piece taped down, the workpiece that I need isn't going to go anywhere. So what I'll do now is I'm going to quick switch out to the other circle cutter. All right, so the big thing here with this one is that you want to test it out on some scrap pieces of hardboard, because you want the diameter that this one is going to create to match real closely to that hardboard disc that's on the sliding assembly. Once you have that dialed in, it's just a matter of making a second cut here. The key thing in all of this is arranging the cutters on your circle cutter so that I have a flat edge on the outside and then a flat edge on the inside here. So you don't want to have the bevel facing the wrong way. I really like using the drill press to take care of things even as mundane as drilling pilot holes for screws, like I did on the plate here. I also used a 3/8 inch bit to drill the pivot hole that will attach the plate to the sliding carriage. So you can see how this is going to work with the handle now. The other thing that goes on here is that donut that I made over at the drill press. And like I said, this is what you're looking for a fit, where it just slides in place. Not a lot of slop there, but it's not going to bind either. So what we're going to do now is a little quick assembly. I'm going to use some of Titebond's quick and thick glue. A, because it's thick, and B, the quick part, I can put a thin bead of glue around this ring. Then I'll fit that over the disc. Now I can take the mounting plate, press it in place, and the quick and thick is going to set up in just a few seconds. So I'm going to hand clamp it here for just a few seconds, and then we'll be able to move on to other parts of the project while we let the glue fully dry. And that other part is to work on the handle. So I had that blank, and again at the drill press drilled out the 2 mounting holes that I'm going to need. And then I used a Forstner bit to drill overlapping holes for the handhold area. Now you'll see there's just these little nubbins that are left over. So I used a file and rasps to clean that all up just to make it comfortable. And then sanded all the edges smooth with a edge sander, or again, files and rasps work really well here too. Then a quick stop over at the router table to ease the edges and make it a little bit more comfortable. Now with the donut attached to the plate, handle taken care of, what we want to focus on now is attaching our angle grinder to that assembly. And we're going to do that by making a pair of plywood cradles. Now there's a couple of things going on here. The first is that when we attach this to the angle grinder, we want to have a secure grip on it so that it's not going to slip around when you're trying to make a cut. The other thing that we want to do is get the angle grinder aligned so that we're making a perfectly straight, or as perfect as we can get it, straight line, and that it's going to be square to our fences. That's going to help us make both accurate and safe cuts. Now there's really no hard and fast numbers here, because what you're doing is cutting out these cradles to match the curvature of your angle grinder. They're all going to be a little bit similar, a little bit different. So what I started by doing is just going over to the bandsaw and making a couple of relief cuts here, kind of approximating what those shapes are. Then to get it flat and square, what I've done is I've clamped a framing square in the face vise of the bench. And now I can set the blocks, or these cradle pieces, in place. When I do that, what I want to have happen is that the disc on the angle grinder should run parallel to this blade of the framing square. If it's not, then you know where you need to make some adjustments, whether to the cutout or to change the height of the cradles to get it right where you're looking for. Once that's in place, we can now take these guys over and do some final assembly on the handle and be able to get ready to actually make some cuts here with this machine. All right, it's time to take care of putting some of these parts together for the handle assembly. So you see I already have the plate and the donut. On this side I just got done attaching the two cradle pieces as well as the small spacer. You'll see what that's for in just a minute. What we can do now is attach the handle. That just gets registered into those little notches there. And then before we attach this to the sliding carriage, I need to install a couple of eye screws. I've already put one in on the sliding carriage back here, and there's another one that'll go on the back side of the handle assembly. Now what these two pieces do is I'm going to connect them with a spring. That way, after you make a cut, the spring will pull the angle grinder back up and retract it, much like a miter saw does. You can see how it's all going to work. Now you want to tighten it up so that it's not going to wobble around, but you still want it to be able to move freely. So we have the handle carriage or handle assembly attached to the sliding carriage. And we have the cradles for the angle grinder. The last thing we need to do is attach the angle grinder securely, but still allow you to get it off and put the springs in place. All right, there's just a little bit of hardware left to install to complete this section of the project. The first thing that we want to do is install that spring on there. So I bent the ends of the spring and I can wrap it around the eye screws and lock it in place. Then I'll just take a pliers and squeeze them closed a little bit. That'll hold it on. So you can see how that's going to retract the angle grinder when you're done with a cut, so it's not going to just be hanging there. The next thing that we want to do is to attach the angle grinder to the cradles so that it'll stay in place. You'll start with just a piece of aluminum bar stock. This is about 1.25 inches wide, and it's 1/16 of an inch thick. And being aluminum, bends really easily. So what you can do is drill a hole on each end for mounting it to the carriage, and then use a machinist vise, and you can easily bend it so that it conforms to the profile, or pretty close to the profile of your angle grinder. It goes pretty quickly. So that way now, you can just use some screws . There, now the angle grinder is firmly attached, but if you need to use it handheld for another task, it's easy to remove. So that completes this section on the sliding carriage of our angle grinder station. In the third and final video, we're going to do some work back on the table here, getting it ready to make some accurate cuts as well as keeping you safe at the same time. So stick around. What we need to do now is to wrap things up with a little bit of metal work here, since this is going to be for cutting metal. What we'll do is add 3 different pieces here. The first is a steel channel that will serve as the bottom of the cut for when we're making cuts in metal, whether it's wide pieces or narrow pieces. What that'll do is allow the blade to be able to cut all the way through the material and have it recessed into the table. On either side of that, we want to avoid any heat buildup that could lead to ignition or from the sparks causing damage to the plywood base. So we're going to inset a couple of wide steel plates. And those will overlap the channel slightly and then also act as a heat sink to keep the piece that you're cutting relatively cool. The final thing is a piece of steel angle iron that's going to get added and will serve as a fence. It'll be mounted in a couple of rows of threaded inserts so that we can have a rear position for cutting wider pieces and a forward position for the narrow stock. So the first thing that we need to do in order to get started is figure out exactly where this steel channel needs to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the carriage forward, slide it down so the disc just touches the base, and I'm going to make a pencil mark there. I'll bring the carriage back, make a second pencil mark, and I can slide this off. Now I'll just connect those two marks. And that's the center line for our channel. What we'll need to do now, head over to the table saw and we'll cut a dado for that channel as well as for the two side plates that are going to go on. Cutting the dado for the steel channel is pretty simple, but there are a few things that you want to keep in mind. First is that when you're doing the layout and then the cutting, make sure you're actually going to cut in the top face of the base here and not the bottom face. It's easy to get things turned around. The second is the channel itself is 1 inch wide, so it's a little bit bigger than what you can get a dado stack set up for. That means you're going to do it in 2 passes. The other thing to consider is the height of the dado blade. Not only do we need to take into account the thickness of the steel channel, but we also need to factor in the thickness of the plate that's going to overlap it. So make sure you do that, because otherwise you'll have to come back here and remake the cut if you don't have those two things considered. Looks like we're ready to make some cuts. I've changed the setup here a little bit, and the big thing is that I've lowered the height of the dado blade. Here what I'm looking for is to match the thickness, or maybe just a hair more than the thickness of the steel that's going to be inset on the face of the base. Now, whereas the dado for the channel was done in 2 passes, you can see this is a much wider set of cuts that we're going to need to make here. So it's just going to be multiple passes. It gets a little repetitive, but if you got your layout lines, it'll go pretty smoothly. All right, we're going to start the next portion of this project with a little bit of drilling to accommodate the metal pieces. We're going to start by drilling into the base. We'll use a 3/8 inch brad point bit here to cut counter bores to hold threaded inserts that the fence will be attached to. All right, now we're going to shift gears a little bit and drill into some metal pieces. I have the U channel here, but the process that I'm going to show applies to the steel plate as well. One of the things that can be hard is marking the hole locations on steel. So I'm using a white colored pencil here to just mark the lines that I'm going to work on. Now when I'm drilling into wood, I'm using a brad point bit and at a pretty high speed. For metal, we're going to do the reverse. I have just a plain old twist bit here, and I've dialed back the drill press to run much slower, about as slow as it can go. You're going to take your time here and work your way through it. This isn't something that you can just speed through. The other thing that you want to do is to have a little light machine oil around to be able to lubricate both the material and the bit. It'll help keep things cool and the bit cutting efficiently. All right, the second part of drilling the holes in the metal is to create a countersink, like what we're looking at here. We want the head of our screw to sit flush or slightly below. So one easy way to size the countersink is just flip your screw upside down, and you should be able to nestle it in and see a little bit of countersink on either side of it. Now to get consistent countersinks, It's really important to set the depth stop on your drill press while you're working here. So again, it's just the same. I'm gonna put just a little bit of oil by the hole and then countersink until I get to the depth stop. All right, after you've drilled all the holes and cut all the countersinks, pulled all the metal splinters out of your fingers, you can attach the metal pieces to the base. You can see it goes pretty easily, especially since you're driving the screws into plywood. Just don't go too far on it and strip them out. Now, while I'm here, I also want to install the threaded inserts in the holes that I drilled in the base as well. Now, the threaded inserts that I'm using are brass. They have coarse outer threads that'll tap into the pilot hole that I drilled. Now the ones that I have a slotted end and kind of a plain end. And the slotted end is for using a flathead screwdriver to twist them into place. I find that problematic at best. And I don't like, this is the fussy part of me, don't like the appearance of that slotted head facing up. So what I'll do is I'll install that down, and then I get a much cleaner look after I install the inserts. Now, the big thing here you can see already is trying to get these installed so they're perfectly square. Now, over the years, we've come up with a simple jig that allows you to do that. It's a piece of 2x material, a couple of notches on the ends, and a bolt with a spring in it and a couple of jam nuts. So what I'll do is put a washer on, twist the threaded insert into place, and now I can set it over my hole, and I'll use a socket So what can happen here is, and what I think I have going on here is that as you try and back the bolt out, the threaded insert stays attached. So what I'll do is reverse the direction on the socket and then just give it a sharp whack with a mallet, and that loosens it up enough to back it out. There we go. So the last thing we need to do now is to create the fence. And I'm just using a piece of angle iron here. It's pretty easy. However, I need to drill some holes to attach it to the base. And then I want to create a little recess in here to allow both the blade and the motor housing to be able to clear it as you're making a cut. Okay, shaping the fences involves a couple of steps here. The first is to cut the long piece of angle iron into 2 pieces so that you'll be able to pass the blade of the angle grinder through it. The second is we need to create a little relief. So on what would be your right side fence, we just did a 45-degree kind of a chamfer or a bevel that I just cut using a hacksaw in a machinist vise right here. Then you want to spend some time with a file, just cleaning up the edges, removing any burrs and sharp corners, both on the cut end and on this back side. Now on the other side of the fence, we needed to make a little bit more room here. So we needed to provide clearance so that when you have the angle grinder tipped down, that this motor housing isn't gonna catch on the fence itself. So you can see that I started with a 45-degree cut and then connected it from the end here with a long straight cut. Again, a little time spent with a file to clean up those edges and then ease the sharp corners there is going to be worth the while. So the fence sections are attached with short bolts that go right into the threaded inserts. And there you have it. This wraps up the construction of the angle grinder station. Now don't forget to check out the other videos where Chris Fitch, the designer of this project, puts it through its paces on how you would actually use it to cut metal. The only thing that I'm going to leave up to you is how you're going to finish this project. Now, for me, I'm probably going to paint this just similar to the one that Chris made, but you could just as easily put a few coats of oil on it or let it accumulate its own patina and grime as you use it. Overall, I think this turned out to be a pretty fun project to build. There's not a lot of complication here, and you can get through the steps pretty quickly. And it turns a simple handheld tool like an angle grinder into a precision cutting tool. I hope you give it a shot. Don't forget to check out the plans at woodsmithplans.com.